It is so good to be here with you guys today, and I'm excited to talk about something that we have been getting some questions about and honestly has probably been on a lot of our minds lately. For those of us in the cattle industry, it feels like we have been on a little bit of a roller coaster for the past few years. The ups and the downs have been tough, and it seems like things are always shifting. Droughts, fluctuating market prices, feed shortages, you name it. There's a lot more to add to that list. So when we think about the future, one big question keeps on coming up. Are we seeing a herd rebuilding phase in the U.S. cattle industry? Is now the time to start expanding and rebuilding our herds, or are we stuck in a holding pattern? So let's dive into it and see where we kind of stand right now. So as of mid-2024, the U.S. cattle herd is at its smallest size in decades at 87.2 million head. That is the lowest that we have seen since 1951. Now, that is a big deal because the size of our herd directly impacts beef production, prices, and just the whole supply chain in general. So how did we get here? Well, there is a few major factors that led us to this point. First, we've been dealing with severe drought conditions in the key cattle producing regions, especially throughout the Midwest. Drought affects everything from pasture conditions to feed availability to water resources. Without good grazing land and enough water, it is really hard to keep cattle healthy and even harder to keep heifers for breeding. If you're a rancher, that means you've got tough choices to make. Many producers have decided to reduce herd sizes just to manage what they could. And that's led to the overall reduction of herd numbers. Second, the cost of feed has skyrocketed. Absolutely skyrocketed. We saw feed prices increase significantly over the past few years, and that pushed some producers to sell cattle rather than to keep them. When the price of feed goes up, it's just not always economically feasible to hold on to more cattle. This, along with other costs like fuel, labor, equipment, you name it, forced many ranchers to make tough decisions to cut back in the past few years. Now that we all know why we're here, let's talk a little bit more about the shrinking herd. In the past few years, we've seen a lot of liquidation in the industry. What does that mean? It means that ranchers have been selling cattle earlier than usual or at lower weights. Sometimes even selling off parts of their herd, especially when it comes to older cattle. This is all a response to the weather and the economic pressures that have made it really, really hard to sustain the herd size that we had just a few years ago. We also saw a significant decrease in the number of heifers being retained for breeding. This is key when it comes to talking about rebuilding. If we want to start to rebuild the herd, we need to start retaining more heifers for breeding rather than selling them off for immediate profits. But with everything going on, the uncertainty of the markets and feed costs, producers have found it harder to do that, and understandably so. If you're faced with high calf prices and the option to sell them for a good price today, it's hard to justify keeping them for breeding tomorrow when the uncertainty of prices is all over the place right now. So that brings us to the next big question. Are we in a herd rebuilding phase yet? In short, not quite. We're starting to see signs of recovery, but the process is slow. There are a lot of moving pieces here. I'll be honest, we're still in the early stages of rebuilding, and it's not happening as quickly as some of us have hoped. And here's why. One of the biggest hurdles right now is heifer retention. And if we're going to rebuild, we need to be keeping more heifers for breeding. But in 2024, heifer slaughter has remained steady at about 8.3 million head. This means that even though we might want to start to rebuild, we're still selling off young cattle rather than holding them back to breed. Why? Because the financial pressures are real. With calf prices still high, there's a strong financial incentive to sell them rather than to wait for the long-term return of them through breeding. We also need to talk about weather, specifically the ongoing drought conditions that we're all experiencing. Even as we head into 2025, much of the Midwest is still seeing drought-like conditions. In fact, about 62% of the U.S. experienced drought at some point in 2024. This affects grazing land, which in turn impacts the ability to keep cattle for breeding. Without good grazing, you can't hold on to cattle or ensure that they're going to be healthy enough to breed. Until the weather conditions stabilize and we see more rain, we're going to be in a holding pattern when it comes to herd rebuilding. And then, of course, we have the obvious economic pressures that we're all facing. Feed costs, rising input costs, and financial constraints have made it really difficult for ranchers to reinvest in rebuilding their herds. While some producers are cautiously optimistic and starting to look at expanding, it's not something they can commit full force to just quite yet. The reality is that expanding herds requires significant investment, not just in the cattle themselves, but in things like infrastructure, in feed, in water systems, and everything else you need to support more cattle. These investments are hard to make when there's a lot of uncertainty in the markets. In the Midwest, where much of the cattle's nation are being raised, weather has been a huge factor in delaying herd rebuilding. The drought conditions have been especially harsh, making it difficult for ranchers to even think about or even consider in the slightest aspect about expanding when they can't even rely on the steady pasture growth and water availability that they currently have. Without those basic needs met, it's not practical to keep cattle to breed them effectively. This is why rebuilding isn't happening as quickly in this region. So, when can we expect to see a significant rebuilding? The most optimistic projections are saying that we won't see anything meaningful in herd growth until late 2025 or early 2026. Even then, it's going to take time. As ranchers start to hold back more heifers, we won't see a flood of calves to the coming market immediately. It'll take a couple of years before a large breeding herd starts to contribute to a bigger beef supply. We're talking about a gradual increase, not an overnight solution. However, there are signs that things will start improving. The weather is beginning to show some signs of recovery with more rainfall in certain parts in the Midwest. That this could help replenish the pastures and give ranchers the chance to keep more cattle for breeding. And if calf prices stay strong, we might see more producers starting to expand again, which could signal the beginning of a larger herd rebuild. Despite the challenges, there is definitely some hope. Some regions are starting to see improved pasture conditions thanks to this better weather, and some producers are cautiously starting to hold back more heifers. The calf market is strong, and ranchers who can weather the storm might start to see payoff of herd rebuilding in the next couple of years. While we're not out of the woods quite yet, we are on a path to recovery. The herd rebuild might not be happening overnight, but we are headed in the right direction. So, to start wrapping all of this up, are we in a herd rebuilding phase? Not just yet, but we are getting there. It's going to take time, and it's going to require a lot of patience. For now, we need to be smart about how we manage our herds, keep an eye on the weather, and make sure that when the opportunity comes, we are ready to take it. Things are looking better, but it's going to take a gradual process. We've seen tough times before, and we'll get through this too. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I'm hopeful that we will start to see a herd rebuild come to life in the years ahead. We'll see you all tomorrow on another episode of the Cattle USA Daily Podcast. Have a great rest of your day, y'all.